Right, so good evening, everyone. If you could take your seats, we'll get the lectures started. My name is Pete Mills. I am the director of the PhD Foundation. I'm very pleased to welcome you all here this evening for the 2024 WYNG-HATTON Lecture, the first time that this lecture has actually come to Cambridge. I've got a few brief notices before the main event. First is that, as you will see, we're being video recorded, and the video will be available on the website after the lecture. So if you don't want to have yourself recorded, please don't walk in front of the camera. There's also a photographer walking around, and if you don't want your picture to be recorded, then please let a member of our PhD staff know. Please also, if you wouldn't mind, silence your mobile telephones. And of course, after the lecture, as you will have seen, we'd be very glad if you could join us for a drink in the foyer behind us. After Eric's lecture, there will be 2 short responses, and I'll introduce the respondents in due course. And after that, we're hoping there will be plenty of time for some questions. But first, I have the great pleasure of introducing or inviting our founder and chair at PhD, Dr. Ron Zimmern, to introduce the 2024 WYNG-HATTON Lecture. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Pete. So, WYNG-HATTON, just a few words about that. This is a lecture that's been going, I can't remember how many years, 7, 8 years, 10 years, in Hong Kong, basically sponsored by 2 Hong Kong trusts, the WYNG and the Hatton Trust. And I'm very pleased that Anthony Ng is here as part of the WYNG Foundation. And they've been very supportive of medical ethics and law in Hong Kong. And this has been really a Hong Kong-based thing with a lecture like this, followed by a conference the following day. And we've had many distinguished lecturers from abroad, including Patrick Maxwell, our Regis Professor of Physics, and also Tim Lewins, who was head of the Department of History and Philosophy of Science. But the idea is that we might bring together people from 3 parts of the world, from Hong Kong, from Cambridge, and from McGill, of which Barta Knopp is again here, and several of her colleagues, and some of them will be speaking at the conference tomorrow. So the idea is that in terms of bioethics, biolaw, this Hong Kong, Cambridge, McGill link will continue. So much for the WYNG-HATTON. I now introduce Eric Meslin, who is the lecturer for this year. He has had to wait several years, poor man. He was the WYNG lecturer for 3 years ago, 2 years ago, and things like COVID and stuff conspired against having a WYNG-HATTON lecture, but he is here now. And Eric is a very good friend of and a senior associate of the PhD Foundation. He is a very distinguished bioethicist. His two big bioethics jobs, I think, were that he was the second research director of the Human Genome Project after another Eric Jongst, and he was also the executive director of the United States National Bioethics Advisory Committee, which was established by Bill Clinton. So he's right there in the bioethics world and right there in the genomics world at the intersection of everything that we do and what PhD Foundation is all about. He has been in Indiana as their first professor of bioethics, and he spent many years there. I won't go into detail, but in the last number of years, he has been in Canada as the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Council of Canadian Academies, in which post he has basically set out 30 assessments and reports for the Canadian government on a variety of topics. So I can think of no one better than Eric to give this lecture, which he's chosen to entitle Artificial Intelligence Policy as a Contact Sport. So contact sport, here we come. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Ron. Well, thank you very much, Ron, for the nice introduction. Anthony, thank you so much for, I think I'm not going to use this because I have this. I'll just put this somewhere like that. Your description of the delay, thank you, in why it took me is kind. I would have walked on, I'm still making echoey. That's a technical term. I'm making echoey. Can you hear me all right? That's all right, thanks. I would have walked on hot coals to come to a WYNG-HATTON. The honor is well known around the world. It's well known in not only the bioethics community, but in the health law community, in the genomics community. And if I can say, the idea of how not only WYNG-HATTON functions, but PHG functions is really a model for interdisciplinary collaboration, for cooperation between and among disciplines, literally across time zones, across continents, and really across colleagues. So it's really a privilege to be here, and I thank you and Anthony for being here. So I just love a good title. But this, you will see, is hopefully more than just a title. Artificial intelligence as a contact sport, but there's a colon, and a really important colon that follows that opening. And it really is what I hope will be a bit of a call to arms, a shot across the bow, a wake-up call, a reminder for all of us in this room and the folks that we work with who might think we've got it all sorted with this AI thing. Got it all sorted. We have the tools, the technology, the personalities, the theory, the practice. This is sort of just another one of those long lists of policy challenges, so we should be good. And I'm going to sort of give you the heads up that maybe not, and we should be sort of paying some attention the more we go along. And honestly, you'd really have to be living under a rock or not having paid attention if you were somehow unaware of the emergence of AI across every sector of society. But I'm assuming that not only you in this room, but folks that you work with haven't been living under a rock, and you have been paying attention, and therefore that you're also aware of the predictions of great benefits and the cautions about risk and harm, with the health sector among the most exciting of these environments where those two considerations intersect. So that's kind of a starting point for what I would like to do this evening, and I want to explore two main ideas. The first is that while AI's promise applies across all of these sectors, each of them is positioning themselves quite carefully and quite intentionally to take advantage of AI's value for their own particular use. The result of this positioning is that when it occurs at this level, the competition can be quite fierce. Whether it's for the billions or trillions of dollars to be made, the careers that will succeed or fail, or the power that might be present, we should not be naive as to the stakes that are at play in this environment. And that's why I have suggested this sort of analogy of AI policy as a contact sport. It is really an environment in which sharp elbows are coming out, and maybe it's something more like this. where you have quite a big scrum going on, a lot of people looking for the same ball, and hoping that at the end they'll, quote, win the game. I promise you I won't push the analogy too far, but this wasn't just a charming attempt to come up with something interesting to get you into the room. I truly think that there is a lot of gamesmanship going on. There is a lot of gaming of this technology, and there are some very high stakes where there will be winners and losers. And if gaming isn't the best analogy, pick your favorite one, but I'm going to just push it a little bit. Now, when I say that competition brings out sharp elbows, let me be absolutely clear about where I stand on competition. Competition is good. Competitiveness is a key driver in innovation. In fact, without competition, we probably wouldn't be anywhere near we would like to be with respect to the development of an application of science and technology to society, and in particular to areas like health. And if competition is a driver of innovation, innovation is certainly a tool that has been deployed to bring out the benefits of the claimed technologies themselves. And by benefits, again, let's be quite clear. We're being told to expect nothing short of life-improving, species-saving, game-changing impact. We're also being cautioned about the risk and the harm. And these risks of harm are nothing short of a full-on existential threat to the planet and all of the inhabitants who dwell thereon. So this is a pretty interesting situation we find ourselves in. So setting the rules for the competition turns out to be a key moral and policy challenge. Too much restraint in order to protect people from harm, and innovation is stifled. Too little restraint in order to promote and unleash innovative power, and people may be harmed. Getting that balance just right, where the competition is fair for all, bringing out the best game and avoiding the worst fouls, falls to two broad domains of expertise that I want to speak with you about tonight: bioethics and governance. Now, these are not historically common teammates, or at least not always regarded as equal members of the team. In the life sciences, ethics has been seen by some as at best a value add for those who work in the compliance parts of their program. We need to have an ethics program, we need to have an ethics committee, we need to have ethics policies, and we do that in order to satisfy a set of meta-criteria that demonstrate to someone else that we're good at what we do, or we won't fall afoul of the rules. It's quite a low bar, actually, but it's a bar nonetheless, and some of us can be either congratulated or can be frustrated by the fact that that may be the claim to fame of bioethics for a great many people in the world. They've heard about an ethics committee or an ethics review committee, or perhaps even an ethics consultant, or maybe a policy, and they think that's the sum total of the contributions. In the worst case, of course, sort of reflected in this sort of charming little photo, people just think that bioethics is just a lot of talk, a lot of interesting words. Some of them don't mean much, or they have different meanings, and it's sort of a lot of talk. So bioethics has a bit of a challenge playing in this high-stakes game, but so too does governance. Governance, certainly by those who are, if not cynics, then trying to be realists, will say that all governance is a focus on rulemaking and management and meetings and processes and procedures, and a lot of it is quite boring and involves paperwork and doesn't seem to add any substantive value. It's sort of the energy that is required to just keep the engine moving. It's rarely seen as innovative, it's rarely seen as nimble or creative, and it's hardly ever founded on, let alone based upon, moral reasoning. So in a sense, a pox on both your houses if you're hearing it this way. But I think these are unkind characterizations. I probably wouldn't be standing here literally because of the background that Ron described. Oh, by the way, if you were paying attention, and since this is recorded, I was not the research director of the Human Genome Project. I was the research director of the ELSI program. Kind of important, the Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications program. My former boss and colleague, Francis Collins, would probably scrunch his nose if he heard me introduced as the research director of the nice title, but that wasn't me. So these unkind characterizations, I can certainly put you at ease. Bioethics has more than 6 decades of expertise in the life sciences, dating at least back to Nuremberg and proceeding through its most recent contributions to genomics, made in many ways by some of the very people who are in this room. And what would a world look like if people had not agreed to organize themselves into civil society and further agree to bind themselves to rules and procedures intended to protect all and promote welfare? I know that's 16th and 17th century social contract theory, but honestly, agreeing to be bound by certain rules and procedures does have certain advantages beyond, living a life that is not solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So governance as a general category of setting policy and guiding behavior has shown itself to be intensely committed to the welfare and interests of those affected by policy. And yet, despite this expertise and all that I've said to this point, I've been wondering. I've been wondering about whether these worlds, these domains of expertise are up to the task of handling what's coming in AI for health. In keeping with the sports metaphor, I'm going to call that part of the talk in a few minutes, upping our game. And I want to make some observations about the type of expertise that is available to work on AI policy now and what still may be needed. In doing this, I want to ask some hard questions about whether bioethics and governance is up to the task of helping design, develop, implement, and evaluate AI policy in the health sector. And don't worry, I'm actually quite an optimistic person, so I hope to close my remarks on an up note by suggesting some ways forward. So let's begin with a quick level set. AI seemed to arrive somewhat unexpectedly for some. Sort of out of the pages of science fiction, with all the attendant sort of promises and perils. And it may have caught people's attention for the first time when Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov in chess in 1997, or the game show Jeopardy was famous because of IBM's Watson computer playing against Jeopardy contestants and winning, or AlphaGo beat Lee Sedol in 2016 in the game of Go. Or probably, if you weren't paying attention then, ChatGPT has probably exposed more people to the ideas than they might have thought. But for those, and I'll even say of us, who've had even a passing familiarity with developments in computer science, neurology, biology, cognitive science, philosophy, law, and dozens of other disciplines, the birth of these technologies, plural, was really the result of a long gestational process. I mean, AI, it's been argued, the term sort of invented or at least proposed more or less around 1955, and has been making incremental strides into the public consciousness since about that time. My first experience with the use of computer-aided design occurred when a computer was designed and used for the first time in the intensive therapy unit at the John Radcliffe Hospital in 1995, after we, that's me on the right, had just finished rounds accompanied by a computer that had a rudimentary futility and life expectancy calculator. And it was literally moved around on rounds, placed between the team, I'm sorry, you're filming me, between the team and the patient. We could have a long discussion about that entire case and what that looked like and what that meant. But it included a number. Likelihood that Mrs. Jones is going to die, 75%. And in one instance that literally pulled up an RIP, like a tombstone. So that was my first experience. It's fair to say that there's been considerable progress since then. And it doesn't take much sort of interrogation of the web to find graphics like these. And I've just pulled a few that were obvious, that were produced by the GAO and Accenture and a few others that highlight the opportunities, the various roles and areas of development in the health sector, from robotic surgery to virtual nursing assistance, administrative workflow, and the like. You've probably seen many of these graphics, and the mere fact that we're able to see these graphics, call them up with a couple of keystrokes on a Google search engine whose algorithm has been programmed in a way to return them to us, is itself quite phenomenal, when many years ago, not too long ago, even that wouldn't have been possible. So there's kind of a meta AI conversation going on about how do we know things, and where do we go to find out the things that we want to go to find out things. You can see how this is both fascinating and, because it's really relatively unregulated, quite intriguing for how it will be applied in policy. So dozens of graphics like this, lots of them use the top 10 model, which is quite an important tactic in short journal papers. We could probably produce a top 10 list of top 10 lists, the ones that are really good, that show you what the lists are. And in this case, many of them could be subdivided, etc. The point is not so much what's on the slide in each individual icon or what it represents, but that this has been a summative exercise that shows, for those who might not be in policy or might not be in the clinical environment, to explain to them in pretty simple terms what the benefit proposition is. And it's pretty impressive. Reducing errors in diagnosis and morbidity and mortality. The OECD estimated in 2023 that 163,000 people died in Europe from medical errors. For those of you who follow the medical errors discussion, it's been going on for quite some time. We've all been getting better at counting and then trying to explain, why is it that these occur? Are they for communication reasons? Are they staffing reasons? But the data are now available in real time. We can reduce surgical complications by robot surgery, speed up clinical trials. One of our issues in Canada is to be able to increase access to care for those in rural and remote communities, where access to a clinician is almost impossible. Indigenous women, for example, in the far north of Canada, are required to fly by helicopter to a major city center, not because they're under some kind of obstetrical emergency, but because there is no one there for thousands of miles. So the telemedicine idea makes complete sense. At the same time, the management consulting and academic literature is filled with market projections that are similar to, oh, sorry, did you miss the slide? Yeah. Oh my goodness, what happened? You missed that slide. Okay, you want me to give that part of the talk again? I'll let you sit on that for a second. This was the slide that said that, because I have two slides on my screen. Sorry about that. This is the slide. You can pick many top 10s. There could be many top 10s. Got it? Smart group, you got it. As I was saying, there are also there's another bolus of both data and literature framed and summarized into tables like this from any particular management consulting group that you wish. or the academic literature that will give you value projections. What will it look like over the next several years? So precedence research with, a market, artificial intelligence and healthcare market, in the 187, 88 billion dollars by 2025, and the top 3 sources of those coming from the Accenture data that the Harvard Business Review released a little while ago, describing robotic surgery, virtual nursing, administrative workflow amounting to about $180 billion US dollars of revenue per year. So these are eye-wateringly large amounts of revenue, numbers that for a different lecture we could ask people whether they understand what $80 billion actually looks like or what it would buy. But just take it as a given that this is part of the why is this a contact sport. When there are hundreds of billions of dollars at stake, people pay attention, and rightly so. But these eye-watering amounts will give rise to a number of concerns. I want to highlight 4 of them briefly for you. They come in this sort of very simple category. And the first is the hype and expectation management problem. So it's been visualized very nicely by the Gartner hype cycle, which you've probably seen. That's in the middle of the slide, where technology often goes through this roller coaster of rising to the peak of inflated expectations before descending through the trough of disillusionment before some kind of enlightenment eventuates the equilibrium they call the plateau of productivity. It's all very charming. Now this is a familiar challenge which I think those of us who've worked in health science and technology for many years are familiar with, especially given that this is the PhD foundation, especially in an area like genomics. Indeed, the concern about hype in the early years of the Genome Project is partly what accounted for the paper that I've somewhat selfishly put in the top right-hand corner in a screenshot of this paper that my colleagues Jim Evans, Tim Caulfield, Teresa Marteau, and I published in Science on the 10th anniversary of the completion of the full sequence of the genome. We called it Deflating the Genomic Bubble. And the reason that we wrote that paper is we were quite excited by the prospects of genomics for medicine and its transformative potential. But we also had a cautionary note about the risks of inflating expectations and what happens when they are unreasonably raised and then dashed, either by bad news in the market or perhaps an unproductive clinical trial, and that expectation bubble bursts. And with that bursting comes a number of unfortunate, unintended, and quite dangerous consequences, ranging from scaled back innovation. People get nervous and decide not to do something. There's less money and therefore less research in the market. There's a missed opportunity, and probably most importantly, there's a loss of trust. Now, we were proposing in that paper to gently kind of let the air out of the tires, pump the brakes a little bit. There are plenty of things going on in public health that are doing pretty well. Thank you very much. You don't have to test everybody for everything. So don't, not so fast. Don't just do something, stand there, in other words. Now this was not just a kind of speculative challenge, and here I want you to interpolate or interpose AI into this same story. So my colleagues and I, we knew that society is often attracted to bright, shiny objects, especially when the objects seem within reach, can be easily identified and named so that it makes sense to them. Stem cell research will, if funded, produce islet cells that can help diabetics. It can produce cardiomyocytes that, when grown, can help people with heart disease. The model of explaining complicated science was, I wouldn't say invented during the Genome Project. Bartha Knopers can tell you more than I can about that history. But there is something about our ability to explain in terms that are understandable that causes that expectation cycle to kind of go haywire. So it's quite an interesting phenomenon. We also knew that the patient community becomes quite impatient with the pace of progress, especially when they've been told that something could be happening, it's just around the corner. They tend to apply a somewhat arbitrary standard of how much time it should take. Usually it's faster than what's happening now, whatever now is and what faster means. But it's certainly not, nothing is ever going at the right speed. It's usually too slow. And when it goes too fast, we're not sure how to respond. So there's a bit of that going on. And we also know, as I had mentioned, that the public's trust and confidence in industry, I hate to say the government, because that term has so many different meanings depending on whether you're a regional government, a national government, a federal government, but the government, which has a fairly shallow reservoir of goodwill that it gets to draw on. And all it takes is a few bad stories for that reservoir to run dry. And it's quite hard to just simply, refill the reservoir. Which reminds me, and this is for Dr. Sawati, it reminds me, it did come up, good, of this scene from the movie The Graduate, if you've ever seen this movie, which sort of plays in a bit of an endless loop when I think about this. It's the scene where Dustin Hoffman, just about to graduate, is taken, by his uncle to the side of the pool party where his parents are throwing him this audacious party for his graduation, and he doesn't know what to do with his life, and his uncle says, just one word for you: plastics. As if that's supposed to get into that business even if you know nothing about it. I'm not suggesting that the word of the day is AI. I have just one word for you. But the simplification of complex science and technology has tremendous benefit because more people can understand what's going on. But the risk is that when it gets simplified to the point of cartoon, then the nuance is lost. So I realize that this sort of overly simplifies a complex ecosystem that really has many, many moving parts. But I don't have time to do it now, but I would just remind you that captured by the picture in the bottom right of the slide that's covered, you can interpose on top of this the so-called infodemic of misinformation and disinformation that is a new intervener in an already complex situation. But I can think of no technology, not the enthusiasm surrounding stem cells or perhaps even gene editing, whose ride on the Gartner hype cycle will be as dramatic as AI. I just don't know the speed of that ride, but it will be there. So let's leave the hype aside for the moment and the benefits and sort of turn to what are the legitimate and understandable risk, whose ignoring apparently we do at our peril. And rather than giving you a picture of some movie star, I'd rather give a real expert, two Canadians, the so-called godfathers of AI, Joshua Bengio and Jeff Hinton, who were two among 21 international experts who published their letter Managing AI Risks in an Era of Rapid Progress last year in the journal Artificial Intelligence, which made a strong case about why the planet should be concerned. I would encourage you to read it if you can. The Reader's Digest version is that, as with climate change, AI may present a legitimate existential threat to the planet. This is not to discount any of the potential benefits, of which there are many, but the scope of the threat means, according to this group, and I would align myself with them, those who know about this have an obligation to take responsibility and act in some way. This is a fairly important point. I'm not slowing down to make sure you hear it, but it is the with great power comes great responsibility argument. They also observed, as many others have, that the threats that are likely, that the threats that exist, their likelihood can be debated, are simultaneously local and global, not one and then the other. They are instantly global. So when the question arises, and it came during the unintended pause, you know, and Pete and I have chatted about this, and I'm sure others of you have thought about it. What's so different about AI? Is it fundamentally different? Not just, you know, it's more, it's faster, there's got more bright, shiny objects. Is it fundamentally, exceptionally different? You'll be disappointed that I'm not going to say yes or no, but I'm going to say there's enough that we know now that if we fail to treat it as fundamentally different and we are wrong, I wouldn't want to be around that planet. So it's a bit of a, you know, a bit of an odd kind of deal that we're making. How risky are you prepared? What's your risk tolerance, either as a planet or as a healthcare community, in terms of the likelihood of you being wrong about the risks and what they would occur? So sort of an important philosophical and psychological comment. Another component, or the sort of third of these, if you were paying attention to the dot points, is this notion of speed. All technologies move at a particular pace that is, at the same time, both quicker than society's legal and moral structures are often equipped to handle, but as I had alluded to earlier, sometimes not fast enough for those who just want the benefit at the end and they don't understand that it might take some time. And darn it, we occasionally have issues like being able to produce an RNA vaccine for COVID faster than anybody ever thought, which leads the public to say, see? We believe you, scientists, so can we do that for HIV, please? It's like, we haven't been able to do that for HIV. So there's this, again, speed plays a fascinating role in this conversation, almost amplified by the horizontality of the sector-by-sector challenge. You know, Jamie Dimon was just quoted, I'm going to say yesterday or a couple of days ago, that the banking industry around the world have now been rated for how prepared they are. And there are 5 banks, the top 5 banks. The third one is the Royal Bank of Canada. Who knew? So you've got banking moving at light speed for reasons related to the financial health and all the things that go along with that, spending billions and billions of dollars. Good, I guess, as opposed to not good. But speed plays an underappreciated role in policy development as well. We know that not all policy problems have the benefit of time and reflection that one might wish one could have in order to thoroughly review a topic before weighing in on what needs to be done. Sometimes things have to be done by Thursday, and that's without all of the evidence, without all the data, without all the clinical trial information. A decision must be made. Sometimes you have until next Thursday. Sometimes, in fact, there are plenty of cases in bioethics where politicians would prefer it took until next century before they weighed in on fill in the blank, end-of-life care, abortion. There's a long list which presents difficult challenges for politicians. Now, we do know and have some good advice about how to think about thinking about this. My particular thought is that Daniel Kahneman understood the psychological substrates for these kinds of policy deadlines, that there are some deadlines that are quick and some deadlines that are far along the way. And the good news is people think differently. I mean, the book, if you haven't read it, it's quite a good book. It's a shorter version of what was a large body of work that led to his Nobel Prize, distinguishes between what is called thinking fast and thinking slow. They're just very different forms of thinking. I would not presume to require a test of every politician or every titan of industry to find out what they are, but I would certainly encourage them to revisit how they do think about these things, because it turns out some people are really good at one and not the other. And just simply knowing what kind you are or what the situation demands can be extremely helpful. So I would say that AI policy development in health needs both kinds, although I don't know if everyone needs to be able to do both in that value chain. Let me turn finally to a favorite topic, sometimes called the suspicion of expertise. I'm here in the UK, but believe me, Michael Gove's statement from 2017 made his way across the pond. You may be familiar with it. He was interviewed on Sky News and said after he had his quote snipped and then recut so that they could hear the full quote, he felt that he was being maligned. The full quote to me doesn't make it sound any better, if you ask me. I think people in this country have had enough of experts from organizations with acronyms that have got things so wrong in the past. The original quote stopped at, have had enough of experts. And he said, that's not what I said. I said, this is what I said. Well, he's not alone. Donald Trump, in a very famous sit-down in the midst of the horrendous fires in California, had this one-off with scientists around the table who said, this climate change thing is wicked and it's a problem. And he's like, oh, don't worry, it'll cool down. So I'm not going to do any more on Donald Trump. So in a sense, if you're keeping score, I'm 2/3 of the way through my remarks. And what I want to sort of flip to now is, okay, so what? Great, got it. We can ask questions about some of the premises of what you're saying, and please do write them down so we can ask. I want to move on to this issue. I use this charming little, what would it take to up our game? I would like to say a little bit about what that actually means, rather than we need to be better at something, or we need to try harder, or think more creatively. There's more to it than that. So this is I wouldn't say it's my wish. I would just say these are some things we need to be thinking about, and this is what it would take to be as prepared as possible to work in AI health policy, and be as convinced as you can that you've given this a thorough run through. The first, and I can't believe I'm using people that I have difference of opinions with in these slides, but the first is the broad category of epistemic humility. Donald Rumsfeld there, the quite controversial Secretary of Defense, uttered the phrase that most philosophers would say had no issue with whatsoever. But the fact that it came out of the mouth of a defense secretary who was arguably not only unpopular, but a scary person, talking about knowns and unknowns and known knowns and known unknowns, they thought that he was babbling on. But he actually was making a comment that is epistemically honest. And the problem is that we don't admit that we don't know things. And we also don't admit what it would take to know things, or what it is that we don't even know that we don't know. And it would be nice to know those things before we could then figure out, okay, now at least I know that I don't know about large language models. At least now I know that. So now that I know I don't know about it, I can learn about it. And this sounds a little sort of funny in a way, but I think there is something extremely important in fast-moving technology applications where there are moral matters at stake to be able to stop and say, wait, I don't know something. No, I mean I really don't know something. And epistemic humility comes in both forms. The first form is what I would call epistemic humility in bioethics, and I'll just lay a few of those out there. And let's remember, because this is the field that I'm from, and there are many of my friends and colleagues in the room, we're, especially the older ones, were around at kind of the founding of the field. I was trained in sort of all forms of bioethics. You saw I had a picture of me at the John Radcliffe. I spent the first 8 years doing real clinical bioethics, doing rounds in hospitals and talking to patients and families and figuring out death and dying problems. Every day in a hospital had a tag that my grandmother loved because it said Dr. Eric Meslin, and I have a philosophy PhD, but she was really happy. And then I transitioned into research ethics and policy ethics and genomics, and there is a sense that, you know, if you're in bioethics, you know all this stuff. Because, you know, they're all ethical issues, whether it's tech or research or clinical or HIV policy. And I think it's time for us as a community to also have a certain amount of humility. What do we know? What don't we know? And how comfortable are we in not knowing stuff? And saying that out loud. I've read, I'm going to say 10 books about AI and ethics, all the good ones. And I probably read, I don't know, 20 or 30 papers. I'm prepared to tell you right now that me being invited to give a talk on AI is hilarious. Because my knowledge of the technology is modest. My knowledge of the history of bioethics and policy development is larger than modest. So I'm just giving you what I think is an obvious example of how we in the field really need to take stock of ourselves. But never mind the people. The field itself is going through a bit of a renaissance. It is a complex ethical terrain, AI, and not just because of the horizontality across sectors, which is huge, or the speed, or the fact that it's not really owned by any one discipline. I mean, this is not like cardiology, and there are a lot of ethical issues in cardiology. AI is not cardiology. We don't even know or haven't agreed on what the technologies are that constitute the field we're talking about. So complex ethical terrain to be applied against many areas. There's subjectivity of interpretation. There's changing in attitudes and thinking about moral matters. There are interdisciplinary interventions and challenges. The field claims to be interdisciplinary. I would say that it's more multidisciplinary than interdisciplinary. There's lawyers and philosophers and theologians and economists, and pretty much anyone can come into the pool. The water's fine. If you're interested in ethics and you want to come to it from cultural anthropology, please come. We'd love to have you. We don't own the pool anymore. The pool was sort of built by the theologians and the philosophers, but now it's expanded into a whole resort with lots of pools and slides and lots of people who don't talk to each other. So we have some work to do there. And we have not in any way come to terms with the fact that it's virtually impossible to get agreement on standards. Standards of practice, standards of excellence, standards of outcomes. We just haven't, that's not to say we haven't tried, but we haven't been able to do that. Governance also has its own share of humility opportunities. Like they say of some of my best friends who are surgeons, you know, if you go and see a surgeon, they will define your problem through a surgical lens. If you go to a family doc, this is what specialty is about. There's a reason why people specialize, and that is to have more information, more detail than someone else. And in the field of governance, the world that thinks that its job is simply to write policy, we need to have a certain amount of governance-inspired humility that a policy, and here I'm using that word very informally, hundreds of versions of or instruments or tools of what a policy might be, everything from a handshake and agreement all the way to an international treaty and everything in the middle. But not everything requires a policy response. I mean, spoiler, I called this talk AI policy, and I didn't tell you what kind of policy I was talking about. I'll let you sort of think through that, or the commentators. Compliance itself, remember my earlier comment, compliance itself is a necessary but not a sufficient basis for enabling AI health itself. That's sort of the low bar of rule following. If you're thinking beyond policy and the government to policy and industry, in organizations that have boards and members, stakeholder engagement and stakeholder interests and members have a set of interests that they think are extremely important, but so too does the public. So what are the consequences of all of this epistemic humility? I think it should be obvious. There is a requisite expectation to both think about what you don't know and why you don't know it, and then to work towards closing that gap, narrowing that delta. This is not an easy task. By the way, full admission, much of the last 10 minutes and my slides were extracted from a query I put on ChatGPT. Go into ChatGPT afterwards and type in, what are the impediments from bioethics and governance to AI policy and health? It was a pretty scary list that I got. It would have easily had a high B or maybe an A- in an undergraduate paper if it was submitted. I had to do that because I'm an ethics guy. So what kind of expertise do we need? Coming into the final straw here. I'm going to give you several of these. One is what I would call deep interdisciplinarity. And I'll let the dot points, in a sense, speak for themselves. I really think that there is an opportunity, especially for those who are interested in not only learning healthcare systems, but the concept of engaged learning, to learn from others. The mention of Jamie Dimon was not an accidental shout-out. There are some incredibly inventive, creative, nimble policy activities going on in areas outside of health. And we should be looking at those. We should be looking at health and housing and employment. Because if we don't, we should be looking at the gaming industry, the actual gaming industry, for which logarithmic development and considerations have been, top of mind for years. We should be thinking about and developing, if not best practices, let's try and find out what some of the leading practices are, irrespective of who has built them and where they come from. Again, I will refer you back to the epistemic humility part. It's hard to just say, we don't know something, let's go ask John down the street. How do I know that John has a better plan than me? So bioethics is going to have to step up. Governance is going to step up. I'm just going to give you one picture that I found incredibly charming. This is a 73-year-old member of Congress, Don Beyer, a Democrat from Virginia, who's a legendary figure in Congress because he sat on the Science and Tech Committee, read every document that he received, read the science literature before a hearing, unheard of in sort of politics, and decided that since he's on the committee that's likely going to be getting a lot of AI coming across, he went to George Mason University, a very prominent university in the United States in Virginia, to get a master's degree in AI. I just use that as an example of someone who is, I don't know stuff, and I've decided to do something about it. So there's an awful lot of learning. All right. I said that I was going to try and leave you with some optimism. Here's the optimism. Here's the optimism. I think there are at least these three reasons why we should be optimistic. The first is that I think it's fair to say there is an awful lot of deep process and content knowledge that we are producing all the time. This is the cheating version of that. This is showing, a curve of the increase in the literature. It's a lousy metric for knowledge increase, but it's a proxy for it. There are similar curves that we could show from the gray literature or from high-quality blog posts or social media that shows many more people, through crowdsourcing means, are becoming interested. So using the old-fashioned model of publications, it's not even a hockey stick. I don't know what we'd call that's like a boomerang showing that increase. With very few exceptions, and until recently, the bench strength, the global bench strength in bioethics was sort of modest at best. But I'm very proud of knowing a number of people, some who are in this room, who have identified AI ethics and AI health ethics as their specialty area, not as a side gig that they're also interested in when they're not doing transplant ethics or COVID ethics or genomics. That it's actually an area of specialization or subspecialization. The second thing that I think gives us some confidence, and this is just one example, is that there are more opportunities in certainly the multilateral governance world where bioethics is being embedded into governance from the start, not as an add-on. So I'm using what I call the pivot to responsible use. This is a slide that shows probably a familiar picture of the recent OECD guidance on responsible use of artificial intelligence. I think it's an example that we can consider. I know Pete and others sit on a number of these committees, but here's what the main components are. It's a set of globally agreed principles from OECD and other organizations. It includes an implementing framework and a validation process involving external experts. In simple terms, it has a beginning and a middle and an end, and it has a way of figuring out whether what it's doing is working. Now, there's a story for another day about what does it mean to say something's working and whether it's working the way that we want it. I'll let others jump in on that. But as a general point, it begins with this presumption that technologies can benefit humanity, that ethics is found throughout, not just at the beginning and not just at the end, and that it applies to the entire value chain of AI and of health. To me, that kind of model is worth, or example, is worth looking at. It is an area that I find particularly exciting. And I'll close with just a quick screenshot from Brian Christian's book, The Alignment Problem, that had a lot of us sort of scratching our head when he said, as you can see on the left side reading over my shoulder, that one of the worries we had is that this kind of release of the Pandora's box was the fate of creating this technology, and in his case, the Sorcerer's Apprentice. And yet the solution seemed ever so simple, and that was, let's figure out how to align values, align AI's values with humanity, rather than worrying about whether AI has its own values. So I thank you for your attention. Apologies for the interruption. I'm putting a few screenshots of groups that I'm affiliated with, include most proudly my association with PHG, Center on Genomics and Policy at Montreal and elsewhere. Thank you very much. Thanks, Pete.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Eric, thank you very much. That was an absolute tour de force, and I've obviously got lots of questions. I'm sure you all have as well. But if you'd like to hold on to them for a little while, I'd like to introduce the two respondents who are going to say a few words following Eric's talk. Our two respondents are Dr. Jeff Skopak and Dr. Kristen Ann Rutter. Jeff is an associate professor in the Faculty of Law and the Deputy Director of the Centre for Law, Medicine and the Life Sciences here at Cambridge. And his current work addresses a lot of issues in artificial intelligence in healthcare, among other things. He, like our other respondent, he has studied, I believe, both at Cambridge and at Harvard. But the thing he's done that Kristen Ann hasn't done is also study at Stanford and serve as a law clerk to the Chief Judge of the United States. Kristen Ann trained originally as a medical doctor, and she is now the Executive Director of Cambridge University Health Partners, which brings together the clinical, the academic, and the industrial partners in Cambridge to give effect to the life sciences strategy. I'm going to ask Jeff to say a few words first, then Kristen Ann, and then we'll have some questions and an opportunity to thank Eric properly after that. So thank you very much. Jeff.
Thanks, Eric, for a great talk. So I'm going to pick up on actually a theme that Eric mentioned when I asked him what he was going to talk about, and we were talking about AI exceptionalism, and he suggested that one thing that might be exceptional about AI is that it's not a single technology, but rather a diverse bundle of technologies that are used across vastly different domains of life. And that this is one of the features of AI that gives rise to some of the challenges that he was talking about today. So I'm generally skeptical about exceptionalist claims, such as the claim that AI is fundamentally different from prior technologies in ways that are legally or ethically relevant. But I think Eric's comment points towards something that is perhaps exceptional, which is not a feature of AI itself, but rather a feature of our response to it. Namely, our attempts to treat it as a single object of regulation. So the attempt to do so has encountered problems from the start. So for example, back in 2017, New York City created a task force to address the city's increased use of AI. But the task force quickly ran into controversy over how to define AI. Some definitions were so expansive that they could include calculations performed by an Excel document. Others were so restrictive that they could exclude analysis performed by humans. 18 months later, when the task force was supposed to be wrapping up, its ambitions had narrowed. Rather than address how the city should regulate AI, their goal was to simply define what it was they were trying to regulate. Many years later, the same definitional problems emerged in the EU's drafting of the AI Act. So these problems point to something that is arguably exceptional, or at least noteworthy, about the regulation of AI. To explain what this is, I think it's helpful to start with a comparison. So take, for example, the regulation of clinical trials, or the regulation of in vitro diagnostics, or drugs, or specific technologies like genome editing. All of these differ from the regulation of AI in two ways. So first, they're all targeted at a very clear set of benefits and harms that are very closely connected to the object or activity of regulation. For example, we want drugs to be safe and effective, and so we regulate them to achieve these goals. Second, even though each of these other areas of regulation contains significant heterogeneity, there's no definitional challenge, as the targets of regulation are defined functionally in terms of what they do. So for example, there's a lot of different types of diagnostic tests, a lot of different technologies, but they can be broadly defined in terms of the function that they serve. But AI isn't like this. The bundle of technologies that fall into this broad category do not serve a coherent function. They do not do anything in particular. And for this reason, they're not deeply connected to any particular set of benefits and harms. So to be clear, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be worried about this bundle of technologies and what they can do. For example, we should clearly be concerned about driverless cars, deepfake videos, chatbots that spread misinformation, and diagnostic algorithms trained on biased data. But these concerns across these various domains do not share a common normative core. So when I first heard that the EU was going to create a new law for AI, I was reminded of an address that a famous jurist named Frank Easterbrook gave at the University of Chicago Law School back in the mid-1990s. He had been invited to speak at a conference on the law of cyberspace to a packed room of cyber law enthusiasts. What he told them, however, was that he didn't think the law of cyberspace was an area of law at all. And in explaining why, he highlighted that there's no such thing as the law of the horse, even though one could form an entire casebook of legal judgments about horses. So for example, there's cases about the sale of horses, injuries caused by horses, the medical care that horses receive, the riding of horses on motorways, and the prizes given at horse shows. But there are no courses or textbooks or statutes devoted to the law of the horse. Rather, we all agree that when a horse kicks somebody, it's governed by the law of tort. If If you ride your horse on the motorway, it's governed by the regulations that govern transportation, and so on. And so for the same reasons, I'm skeptical that we should try to create a law of AI. Like the horse, AI does not have a core set of functions, nor is it closely connected to a core set of benefits and harms. And for this reason, I agree with Eric completely when he suggests that we need to up our game in this area of regulation. We need to be guided by close attention to the specific benefits and harms that concern us, and not by the cluster of fears and hopes associated with the idea of AI.
Thank you. And Eric, I certainly welcome the wake-up call, because from a health system perspective, and people trying to implement this technology within the healthcare sector, the engagement with the legal, the governance, the bioethics is sorely needed. You made the point of the huge promise of AI in health, those 163,000 errors caused by death. It's quality. I love the fact that you started with quality. It's also workforce, it's also money and finances. And so just for a moment, why is AI needed in health? It's not just the promises, but we desperately need to implement this technology. The health system in this country, as many of you know, is struggling with the highest levels of dissatisfaction and also some of the lowest levels of productivity we've seen. Waiting lists for routine hospital treatment in England are now at 7.7 million and rising. That's an all-time high. And that's where we are now, and we are facing a tsunami. I don't know if those who saw Chris Whitty speak recently about the future of the healthcare system, it cannot carry on as it is now. The number of over 65s in this country is set to double within 4 years. We cannot continue to give them care or look after them in the same way that we have. And by 2040, 1 in 5 of the adult population in England will be living with a major illness. And that's an increase of 2.5 million people that we're going to need to care for. So we need those promises of AI to come to reality in a safe way. The good news is that they are already today, and that's why it's a live problem and why we need to engage in this contact sport pretty quickly. Just here in Cambridge, we've had Raj Jena develop a technique that allows us to program radiotherapy for patients 4 times faster than it's cut the time from 4 hours to 1 hour. We've got Anna Moore looking at how we can use AI to really understand what children will benefit from the healthcare, mental health implications that we're all reading about on a daily basis. We're using AI to read pathology images, which is starting to reveal to us stuff that we've never seen before. I was at a talk yesterday by Harpal Kumar, who was talking about Galleri. When they use AI to look across the genetic data that's been gathered by that test, they're getting some false positives, but some of those false positives aren't false positives. They're cancers we can't see on radiological images, but they appear 2 months later. So they're not false positives, but we just didn't know they were there, and our current ways of detecting them, other than AI, can't pick them up. So there's real excitement there, but it's a live problem. So your agenda for us to engage now is really important. The second thing is, though, and why I think I'm probably standing here at the invitation, is that I'm working with that governance ecosystem of the NHS, with NHS England, to think about how they do put in their governance policy around innovation. So there's a review at the moment of the NHS. How does the review NHS adopt innovation? And much of that innovation is related to AI. And when I'm talking governance, I'm talking the structures, the incentives, the skills, the frameworks, the regulations that the NHS to allow us to adopt this safely. Because if we don't get this right, we will not just settle into that valley of disillusionment, but the health service will just put the brakes on and just say no, as it has done historically in the past, as it often does to many innovations. And in some ways, maybe that's not a bad response when so much harm could be had. But when there's such a need to do it well, we can't afford to have just say no. And so what do we need to talk about when we engage between legal ethics, governance, bioethics practitioners. And I'd like to say we need to think about three things. The first, obviously, is that regulation. How do we get comfortable with the risk that AI? How do we take the step? How do we use it responsibly? How do we get it used in a way that is fast and responds to those needs? For example, that technology that I talked about on radiotherapy, it's only in use in one hospital. It's only in use in Cambridge at the moment because we haven't got the regulation to roll it out to other hospitals across the country and kite market in a way that we can use it. That's ridiculous. So we need to sort this out and be comfortable with leaning a little bit forward on risk, but knowing that actually if things start to go wrong, we can unwind it. And the health service is very bad at doing that. Once they commit to something, they never go backwards, and that actually therefore hesitates you to move steps forward. So that's the first thing, the regulation, the governance. The second thing, though, is we need to help bridge the gap between the health service and not just the bioethics and the governance, but also the technicians. The health system doesn't really understand AI. I certainly don't, but most technologies in healthcare have previously come from within healthcare. They've come from doctors innovating or from scientists working closely or people in the lab. This technology is coming from outside of healthcare, from people who are not familiar with it, don't understand how to deploy it, don't have the expertise, don't know. And that gap is really hard. And I talk to Google or Microsoft, and they say, we've got all these tools. You could do this. Yes, of course you could translate your letters. You could deploy it to do that. You could solve that problem today. And I'm like, well, that doesn't help me because I can't bridge the gap. I've got nobody who can deploy your technology to do that and translate the letters. So we need to help bridge that gap. And we also need to test and deploy and engage with the practitioners early in the way we did with the COVID vaccine, and the way we're doing with the collaborator, to help them get on the journey early before this technology is ready to deploy, help them to shape it, direct the need for it, get it deployed in the right way. And that will be beneficial both ways, because then we'll get the right technology we need and we'll have a healthcare system that understands it a little bit more and is prepared to adopt it. And the final thing we need to think about, third thing, is how we think about the data that sits behind AI. An allusion was made to bias data earlier on, but the data in the health service is not where it would need to be to take advantage of AI at the moment. You know, I was also to talk yesterday where it was pointed out that we don't know how many women in this country have metastatic breast disease. Just don't know that. We wouldn't be able today to write to all the patients in our hospitals who have diabetes and might be eligible for a clinical trial. I've just tried to extract 400 lines of data, which is going to support a nice application for a rare disease, and we can't work out who, between British Heart Foundation, the University of Cambridge, CUH, various other grant funders, own the IP on that data. So there is I don't want, before we get to AI, I don't want to forget the data problem and the data infrastructure that sits behind that. But I'd also like to end on an opportunistic note, in that actually this is a contact sport, and if, particularly in this room and with this crowd in Cambridge and McGill and Hong Kong, we can't bring the right people together to solve this and to work together on it, then it's not going to get solved anywhere. So let's not make this someone else's problem. Let's try and grasp that problem and say, what are we going to do to engage the public and the practitioners and be bold, the right balance of slow and risk? What are we going to do to bridge those bridges, and how are we going to address the data problem?
Thank you, Kristen Ann, for those, and to Jeff for the thoughtful and thought-provoking, I think, responses. Now, we have a bit of time for questions. We've already had 2 responses, so if in asking your questions you could keep them framed as questions and as brief as possible, that will allow as many people as possible to get in. Eric, do you want to come back and take the podium again, and I'll be your spotter, if you like. We're going to be on... And we right. For that. Thank you. Jonathan Montgomery's got a question.
Thanks, Eric, for a fascinating lecture, and especially for the John Radcliffe reference, where I was until lunchtime, where I chaired the Foundation Trust. I think it's really interesting to bring together the bioethics and the governance, and as you know, I've been interested in that for quite a long time. I'm wondering whether humility is going to do enough work for you, and I wondered whether you thought that the work around epistemic justice and injustice would help us take humility from being a sort of passive issue about not claiming too much into working out how to respond when we're a bit more humble.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's a great, no, you're not supposed to say it's a great question. That's one of those things you don't say. Of course it's a great question. Short answer is, I'd love to go there. It's not an either or. The proposition that there are things we don't know almost seems so obvious that I felt it needed to be said. Because in an environment where everyone is an expert or thinks that they know what an expert is, never mind Gove or others. I mean, John Maynard Keynes even said that the thing that governments hate most is information, because it really makes decision-making hard. So I realize that some of this is a bit of an aspirational, almost virtue-based comment. It's not a throwaway comment, but I don't want to move too quickly past it on the way to let's solve the problem, because you then have the why should I listen to you? Do you know where do we stand? Now, to fully answer the question, I'm absolutely fascinated by the topic of what counts as fairness or equity, and what counts as, we were chatting about this, some of us at lunch, what counts as discrimination. I mean, the list is quite long. The good news is, sort of enter stage right, the bioethics community that says, we actually know a little bit about that topic. We've been thinking and talking about that topic for quite some time, and much like, and I should have said thanks to Jeff and Kristen, and I really appreciate your comments, and I could have listened to you give 40 minutes each as well, so I'm very grateful for your thoughtful intervention. But it was Jeff's comment before about not just the horse, which we're all going to remember. You'll remember nothing about this evening except there is no law of the horse. The idea that as something is a bundle of either technologies or tools is, I think, worth thinking through, because if you're responding to what is the problem that this, quote, policy toolbox is designed to solve, you better figure out what the it is and who has a stake or who has an interest. I will say that we do have an existing slightly off-point analogy, and that was the Genome Project. So for those who followed the story, you know, the U.S. National Institutes of Health, plural, has 27 institutes. 26 of them are devoted to a body part or a disease. National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, right? National Cancer Institute. There's only one that is devoted to tools, the National Human Genome Research Institute. And there was a great debate once we had finished the mapping and sequencing. Why do you need an NHGRI when, okay, thank you for the sequence, we'll take that, and we'll just move over there and take it all to NCI. So the question about how do we, and if we're negotiating in a way, which we're not, Jonathan, I'd like to keep my epistemic humility on the table while it's sort of there, and then use it to sort of bootstrap the justice bit. Because I think the humility part is so connected to expertise and who's entitled to talk and what counts as standing. And the moment we do that, we've probably excluded half of the population who may have an interest, those who are affected by and potentially harmed by it. So I very much am sympathetic to the position. I'm not holding on like like I'm on a rock climber to this epistemic humility bit. I just think it needs to be, we need to say it, call it out, and work on it while we're doing the other stuff.
Can we stay at the back and then we'll come down to the front?
Thanks for the great talk, Eric. My name's Julia Powles. I'm a law professor, but I've been studying AI policy for over a decade. And I want to be a bit provocative in response to your title. I think right at the beginning and for the first third, you really had the ball. And I want to challenge that I think you then dropped it. And the reason you dropped it is I think when you had the ball, you were talking about money and power. And this industry is consolidated into a few companies led by marketing professionals. And there are three features that they are marketing something that is just about getting that curve, no matter what. Second, what they can do is very limited, and it's limited to a particular scientific model that came up at the end there. It's recycling data, it's looking at the past, it's calling it the future, it's not experimenting and looking out at surprises, which is how most of scientific discovery has come along. And I think the reason we're at responsible innovation is because the only other policy domain where we put responsible in front of something is the gambling industry. So they are built on a model that is just boost this thing, get people rolling the dice, see what sticks. So my question is this. From the ethical perspective, how do you respond if there are two features of this industry? One, how they've refined the tools over the last decade has been to, the principal use case has been generating images of women that are sexual abuse material. And that's to millions of people. It has been against women who are political actors through to people who no longer associate online. So that's the legacy of this industry. And the second is that it's built on the back of theft of work from every country and every creator. And they're getting away with it because we keep talking about this promise that is frankly a bit of labour saving along the way and not a whole lot of great scientific discovery. There's my challenge.
That's really great, and I'm not sure that I dropped the ball now that I think about it. I may have juggled it a little bit, but I felt that I held it for most of the run. What I hear you saying and think I can respond to briefly, but related to my remarks, is the following two things. I think I feel even more strongly today than I did even a year or two ago that the definitional problem of what this, whether it's bundle or cluster of tools are being used, is the single most important governance problem that we're going to face in handling any type of emerging technology, precisely because of a couple of things that Jeff and Christian Ann said. There's the externality problem. This was parachuted in. We've got this great thing we'd like to sell you. It works. Would you like to buy it? We're completely on the same page. In the absence of a world court or the absence of a global governance structure that would adjudicate the use or misuse. I mean, let's not forget, Pornhub operates out of Montreal, Canada, and its business model is apparently spectacular for reasons that relate to your point about, responsible. And there's responsible drinking, by the way, not just the gambling. It goes all the vices if you turn them into responsible. So I'm going to sort of push back on the gentle push about how it is that a cluster of technologies and techniques, some of them are recycled and repackaged, some of them are genuinely new and interesting, are meant to deliver on a promise that is equivalent to the promise that we normally see in health tech generally. And I see that as not a bridge too far, we're all mixing our metaphors, but I see that as a fundamental problem. So is it, how do we deal with, like, the real world is there's marketing guys, there's marketing people, and there are folks who are exploiting, whether they're exploiting the data that they have, whether exploiting the labor that produced it. In a way, we have rules for that too. We have, or should have, structures in place for handling quote-unquote bad actors, for handling international or interjurisdictional import-export issues. I don't know if this is the case of AI exceptionalism. In fact, I would say that AI is a boring example of an issue that is already facing the planet. So you can see I'm a little bit of, maybe I'm dancing rather than maneuvering. And it's partly because I'm a real fan of UWA, where I spent many years visiting and know where you're from. So more at the drinks, maybe. That's a tough crowd. Yeah, got it.
Dimitrios Flaudas, I lecture in artificial intelligence regulation. Yesterday, the New York Times published an interview with the co-founder of Anthropic AI. In it, he said that he was expecting that by next year, one of the large language models, the one that you actually saw yourself and you were mildly horrified by its responses, will be able to exist in the wild, as they say. So it would have actually broken its containment. Now, doesn't this mean that all of us who actually are dealing with AI policy and regulation are at least 3 steps behind? And probably we have already dropped the ball and we don't even know it.
Yes is the quick answer. One of the tools that a lot of us who work in multiple disciplines use is the power of the analogy or the case study. So as you were speaking and referring to the breaking its bridle or whatever we wish and leaping over the fence and running down the path, we've had those examples. Genomics has been worried about this from the early days of recombinant DNA and asilomar all the way through GMO foods. So we have tools in place. We have conceptual tools, risk modeling tools. We have what do we do when something has left. We have a big pile of tools. I have a slide that I've used in other talks, which is literally a toolbox with about 100 different types of instruments or tools. Everything from executive orders to legislation to advisory committees. And among the things, this sort of goes back to Julia's question, I'm not sure that we know which is the right tool for the right reason at the right time. We might use a lot of blunt instruments. We might use the hammer because we see it all as a nail. But whether we're behind, I'm not so worried about behind, in front, beside. It's what are we going to do now to make progress towards that problem, even if it's an asymptote towards we're never going to get there because it's always going to be ahead of us. That's kind of what we like with technology. It should be a little bit ahead. But I guess I'm not cynical or as concerned about how far behind as I am what are we doing today to make up time. And I think there are a number of things that we can talk about during the drinks about what that might be, but I appreciate the question. Thanks. Good.
So that's a great segue, Eric, thank you very much, into drawing the formal part of this lecture to a close. Before I do, I'd like to thank a number of people. I'd like to thank St. Catherine's College for welcoming us, our events team and manager Samantha outside, who's helped us bring this all together. Very importantly, I would like to thank the WYNG Foundation and the Hatton Trust for sponsoring this event and making it possible for Eric and the rest of us to convene here in Cambridge this time. I'd like to thank Kristen Ann and Jeff for their thoughtful, thought-provoking responses to the talk. But most importantly, I would like to thank Eric on behalf of everyone here, Dr. Eric Meslin, for a really, really stimulating, timely and important talk. I'd now like to invite you all to join us in the foyer outside to enjoy a drink and continue the discussions that we've been having here. So thank you very much, Eric. Thank you.